Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of GDDV 100 Game Theory 1. My name is Kasanas. So guys, moving forward here, let's take a look where we've been. We've already finished our course intro, we've already talked about what game is, we talked about different design thinking and methodologies, and we've talked about the idea of flow states and immersion. We're still on week 3. We're just moving on to the idea of how we can affect flow states and immersion and what we can do as far as design is concerned to make sure that our players remain within our flow channel. All right? So today we're going to talk about the idea of feedback loops. Let's get started. So let's start off with a review of what flow and immersion is. I know this is just a recent video, but let's go over it again because it's really the important part of this particular video. Our goal as designers, as game designers, is to ensure that our player, regardless of their skill level, has an enjoyable, in quotes, you can't see my air quotes, but I'm making air quotes, an enjoyable experience, right? If our game is too challenging for the player's skill level, they will become anxious and they will quit our game. They'll get out of it, they'll say, that's it, too hard, and they're out. If our skill level far outmatches whatever challenge we're putting forward to our player, they're going to get bored, horribly boring, they're going to shut our game down, and they're going to leave. Our goal is to make sure that the skills and the challenges are matched up. And if we can match up the skills and the challenges, then we've got ourselves this immersive state where our player becomes lost in our game. We steal all their time. That's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to immerse our player in our game. We're trying to give them an enjoyable, again in quotes, experience regardless of their skill level. We have to try and match the challenge and the skill level. And that's the big problem. We understand the idea, what we're supposed to do, but how do we do that, right? How do we go about and match the difficulty of a task to the player's skills? Particularly if we've got players of differing skills, right? Lots of different people are going to play your game. We're hoping lots of different people are going to play your game. How do we make sure that the person who's played the game for the very first time enjoys or feels equally immersed as those who are experienced within the genre and really understand the genre already, right? We want to make sure that the experienced player and the novice player still have the same immersive experience. So what can we do with players of varying skill levels? And this is the question we want to answer today. And there's a couple of different answers for you. And I know the first thing that a lot of people think of as well, I'll add a difficulty setting, right? Where my players can choose between easy and normal and hard and they can play their game. And that's going to really set the tone. The player has choice, and that choice is going to make the game enjoyable for the players or immersive for the players. And that's not necessarily the case, right? We've got a couple of problems when it comes to the idea of a difficulty setting. First of all, a player may choose the wrong setting, and if you're in some type of campaign, let's say that you've got some longer campaign game, some campaign-based game, and I've set it to a difficulty that's either too easy or too hard. Let's say it's too easy, and I decide, okay, this is too easy for me, and I want to switch it because it's getting really boring and really repetitive. I want to switch this over, and I come to the realization that I can't dynamically shift this. I have to start the entire campaign over again on a harder difficulty. That's the case with a lot of games. I played the BattleTech game recently, the strategy BattleTech game, and you had to set it up initially how you were playing the game. And if you wanted to play the campaign on a particular level, it was difficult to switch it. I think you couldn't even switch it. I think I had to start the entire campaign over on a higher difficulty. And that gets a little bit depressing. If I've got a lot of progress within my game, I don't want to redo the entire thing, right? So having an option to set your difficulty is great, but we really need to set up an option for players to be able to change that difficulty partway through the game and have the game dynamically switch after that choice is made by the player. The other problem we've got with it is lots of time people will look at this, and there's sometimes it's the designer's fault, right? They'll look at the difficulty settings, and one is, instead of being called, it's called like, instead of easy, it's like for babies, and then macho men is the hard one, or whatever. I don't know, those are dumb terms, but something like that, right? And there's really this, it's put into context. Like if you're playing easy, then maybe you shouldn't be playing this game anyway. And if you're the cool guy, if you're playing in the hard level, right? And that is not an attitude that we want to have our players be faced with. We don't want to have them pressured into playing a game that is too difficult. Our goal is to have them be immersed in our game. And they're not going to be immersed if we've tricked them or pressured them into going into a difficulty level that's too high, right? So we can avoid all that by either using proper terminology within our game and not making people feel bad about the levels they choose, or by ensuring that the game is can be changed partway through. An example, I recently played Beat Saber, and I don't usually play games like this. I really enjoyed Beat Saber, but I'd never played a game like this before. I'd never used really VR before, not that heavily anyway, a little tiny bit. But I'm getting into VR development now, and I'd really like to understand it better, obviously. So I put it on, I get Beat Saber, and I'm trying it out for the first time, and I set it on easy. And I realized right away, easy is not where I want to be, right? It was okay, because I could finish off this 2-minute song on easy, and it was no big deal, and I could reset the to hard afterwards, which is what I ultimately ended up playing on hard for the last little bit. I can play hard and switch it right away. No big deal at all. But if this had been a long campaign, if I'd been in the middle of a campaign, for example, where I'd chosen easy and I was stuck with like 2 hours of gameplay on easy, I probably would have given up the game right away. So make sure that if you're adding a difficulty selector to your game, you understand exactly what you're doing to your player, right? Maybe give them options to be able to change that dynamically. The second option that we're going to talk about, and this is really the main focus of this particular video, is the idea of a feedback loop. Creating a feedback loop. And a feedback loop is a dynamically shifting difficulty level. That's really what it is, a dynamically shifting difficulty level. A great example is in Left 4 Dead. In Left 4 Dead, they included what was called the director, or the AI director, and the AI director evaluated the player's experience. So how were the players doing on any given point within the level? If the AI director found that the players were doing too well, then it would reduce the number of pickups in the game. And this is dynamic, right? You don't even see this. It's not something you're setting yourself. It's all happening in the background, so you don't even know what's happening. As you do better, the number of zombies increased and the number of pickups decreased, and some doors were locked that would make it, a shorter path through the level, etc. Right? If you were doing poorly, then there would be less zombies, more pickups, and maybe some doors were open or some paths were open that wouldn't necessarily be open if you're doing really well. And this all happened in the background, all right? This dynamically shifting difficulty all happened in the background. It was invisible to the player, so they were able to remain immersed without having to concentrate on the difficulty level of the game at all. Amazing. So that brings us to the idea of feedback loops, and that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about feedback loops. There are 2 different kinds of feedback loops, positive and negative. Positive feedback loops and negative feedback loops. And oftentimes when I say these words, my students immediately think of a good thing or a bad thing, and that's not what it is at all. A positive feedback loop is a reinforcing relationship, and that means that if you've done something, it's easier to continue doing that thing within your game. And a negative feedback loop is a balancing relationship, or an equalizing relationship. If you've done something, it becomes more difficult to do that thing as you progress within the game. So it's not something positive or something negative that's occurring within the game. It is either a reinforcing relationship or a balancing relationship. Let's start off by talking about the idea of a positive feedback loop. And a positive feedback loop is a trend in a particular direction, in the same direction that you're already moving. That's what it is. All right, something happens in your game and it becomes easier to do that something over and over and over again. It amplifies the original event. If we take a look at the idea of the screech that you hear when someone talks into a microphone, they talk into the microphone produces sound that comes out of the speakers then feed back into the microphone, and it loops around until eventually you hear this like loud screeching noise, and they stop talking and it goes away, right? That is a positive feedback loop. It's obviously a negative event, but that is a positive feedback loop. It's a reinforcing relationship. There are a couple of things that define a positive feedback loop, or that happens generally within a positive feedback loop. Destabilization of the game. So as one player gets further ahead, they are more likely to continue to be further ahead, right? As they start to win, they are more likely to win, all right? Or if they start to lose, they are more likely to lose the game. This in turn causes a destabilization within the game itself. It causes the game to end faster, right? If I'm winning and winning becomes easier, I'm going to win faster. Okay. It puts emphasis on early game effects and strategy. That means the things that you do in the beginning of the game are more important than things you do at the end of the game, right? Because whatever you do at the beginning is going to be emphasized, it's going to be reinforced as the game progresses. If you've made good strategic decisions in the beginning of the game, they will pay off towards the end of the game and end the game faster. Decisions are magnified over time, Meaning, again, that if I've done something, it's going to reinforce, it's going to combine with the other events to make this even better or bigger. If I've made a poor decision at the beginning of the game and I'm in a poor position, a strategic position, for example, then as I move forward, it's going to become more difficult for me to win. So it's all magnified. The big problem with a positive feedback loop is immersion, right? It's not that you immediately lose immersion, but as it becomes evident that there's no hope to win, oftentimes players become bored, right? And we already know that boredom leads to a loss of immersion. We want our players to remain engaged. Once our players have decided that that's it, I can't win anymore, they give up and they're no longer in your game, all right? In your game, they're out of it now. They're no longer immersed, and that's not our goal. Lastly, it can strip any meaningful play or meaningful choice within a game as you move later within the game, right? You get to a point, you know you've lost. There's nothing that you can do to change it. You can stall maybe for a little bit, but you know you're going to lose, all right? So any meaningful move that you may have has been stripped away. That's a positive feedback loop. You might want to add a positive feedback to your loop to your game if you want it to end quicker, right? If you want it to end fast, you're going to want a positive feedback loop in there. So an example is Monopoly, and a Monopoly is a very obvious positive feedback loop. As players circle the board and they collect property, the more property they collect, the more likely it is that they will collect more money, and the more money they collect, the more property they can buy. If you are winning the game. If you are losing the game as you circle the board and your opponent has all the property, you are more likely to land on that property, lose your money, meaning you can't buy any additional property, and you're going to continue to lose money as the game progresses. All right, that's it. That's it. So if you're winning, you are more likely to win because you have everything, and if you are losing, you are more likely to lose all of your money because you have no way of purchasing property to progress. That is a very evident and obvious positive feedback loop. And we all know, we've all played Monopoly. I hope you all have anyway. We all know what happens when you are losing and how depressing it gets and how you just realize you're in this hole and you don't even want to play anymore. Maybe just me. Maybe I'm a sore loser. I don't know. But that's a very obvious positive feedback loop. When we talk about the idea of the negative feedback loop, again, it's a balancing relationship. And that means that if something is happening within a game, it's more difficult for that same thing to continue happening. If a player is winning, it becomes more difficult for that player to win. And if a player is losing, they are more likely to begin to catch up to the person who's winning. All right, so they're gonna. It's a balancing relationship. You're moving towards the center of this particular game. So a negative feedback loop is defined by certain things as well. Again, it tends to stabilize the game, and that means that all the players are kind of moving towards the center of the game. It can cause a game to take a lot longer, right? As a player begins to win, they're pulled back, right? They're pulled back. So in this particular case, emphasis is put on, with a case of a negative feedback loop, emphasis is put on late game decisions. Early game decisions are almost penalized in a way because there's a balancing relationship that occurs there. But as over time, as you, the impact is lessened over time. But in time, as you progress through the game, the decisions you make become more important, right? There's going to be a point where there's a sudden switch and someone wins the game, all right? In the case of immersion, a negative feedback loop can aid in immersion because a player doesn't feel that they're out of the game, right? There's not a point where it's just, I'm lost and they give up, right? Something might happen towards the end of the game where they suddenly pull ahead and win. But throughout the game, players still feel like they have an impact. They still feel like they have choice within the game and they still have gameplay options. All right, so the players are really moving towards the center of a pack. That's what a negative feedback loop is, a balancing relationship. And there are lots of different examples of a balancing relationship. Dungeons and Dragons and most RPGs as an example, as a player progresses through the levels, at level 1, they can easily fight, or they have a difficulty fighting goblins, right? If you fight a goblin and you're level 1, you fight a number of goblins, you might be overwhelmed and you might die. As you progress the levels, if you continue to fight those same goblins, you've got it becomes too easy, right? You're just going to wipe them out without having to do anything. One player can take on thousands of goblins with their fireball or whatever it is they've got. At some point, it becomes too easy to fight the goblins. Well, most RPGs progress through this by increasing the difficulty of the monsters that you face or the mobs that you're facing, right? You no longer face goblins, you're suddenly facing dragons, and you stay equal. Your power and the mob's power is about the same. So the amount of experience it takes to go up a level goes higher and higher and higher and higher as well, right? So Dungeons & Dragons and most RPGs are definitely a balancing or a negative feedback loop. Most racing games also have this type of thing where the player who's ahead, unbeknownst to the player who's winning, maybe their top speed drops a little bit, or maybe their handling goes down a little bit, and it gives the players in the back an opportunity to catch up. All right, this is hidden from most of our players. So there could be a speed boost for the lower players, or an increase in handling for the lower players, etc., and allowing them to catch up. In Mario Kart, there's obviously special things that you can pick up, a negative feedback loop. There are special events that can occur that only target the player who's in front, right? Automatically targets that first place player, knocking them back and allowing other players to catch up. All of this stuff is really in there as far as a negative feedback loop is concerned. Something else I want to talk about there, let me give you a really fast example of a balancing relationship that might automatically occur. It can be an unwritten rule before I go on to the different types of feedback and what you need as far as that's concerned. If you take a look at the game Settlers of Catan, or even for that matter, Settlers of Catan or Cities and Knights, one of the other versions of Catan, if you've played this game, there is a very obvious positive feedback loop built into the game. As you build more cities, as you build more towns, as you build more roads, etc., you have more inlands into, or inroads into better numbers, right? So as you roll the dice, you are more likely, if you have more cities and more towns, you are more likely to collect resources. And in collecting more resources, you are more likely to be winning the game. Now, an unwritten rule that's happened in every single time that I have played, and with anyone I've ever played Catan with, is people stop trading with that first place player, right? So there is this very obvious positive feedback loop built into the game, right? Where the first place player is pulling ahead. But the negative feedback loop that's automatically applied, this unwritten negative feedback loop, is no one will trade with that player anymore. So even though they're winning, it becomes more difficult for them to win, right? Because no one's going to trade anymore. They're only trading amongst themselves, and gives other players a chance to catch up. So even though some games may have a very obvious positive feedback loop built into it, even if you have designed a very obvious positive feedback loop into your game, players themselves, through their own unwritten rules, could very well add in their own negative feedback loop and cause a balancing within that particular game. So let's go on now to the idea of what we need to create a positive or a negative feedback loop. There are three components: a sensor, a comparator, and an activator. The sensor really just monitors the game state. It sends information back to the comparator and says, hey, this is where we stand. The comparator, in turn, then decides what action should be taken. Should it be made more difficult? Should it be made easier based on the information or the input from the sensor? And lastly, the activator then modifies that game state based on what the comparator decides. So the activator itself is what goes ahead and makes the decision to change the game as it's moving forward. So we've already discussed the idea of Left 4 Dead and the AI director, how it monitors the player's progress based on a whole bunch of things and changes things automatically. It's a negative feedback loop. Resident Evil 4, exactly the same thing. If a player is doing poorly, the number of enemies are reduced, etc. So there are a lot of games where this idea is already built in, right? A lot of people build this stuff into their game, and it's oftentimes unbeknownst to the players at all. They don't feel bad about where they're at because they haven't set any kind of difficulty level. All they know is they are moving through the game, they're progressing through the game, and that progression allows for the players to remain immersed within the game. All right, everybody, that's the idea of positive and negative feedback loops. They're really important. Understand what you're putting into your game, understand why you're putting it into your game. What experience do you want your players to have? Positive or negative feedback loop is not, one's not better and one's not worse than the other one, right? They have very specific purposes within your game. End it faster, drag it out longer, maintain choice, etc., right? Understand why you're putting that negative or positive feedback loop in your game. If you've accidentally put one in, try and figure out ways that you can counter it by changing your mechanics slightly to add in a negative. If you've got a positive feedback loop and you don't want that, try and figure out how you can tweak your mechanics in some way to change it so you've got yourself a negative feedback loop, or add additional mechanics so you've got yourself a negative feedback loop, right? Understand what's in your game, understand the experience your players are going to have. All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that. I really hope you did. If you did, let me know down below with a thumbs up. And if you didn't, thumbs down is fine. This is for my students. I hope they're enjoying it. I'm hoping they're enjoying this method of learning. I myself am really looking forward to this asynchronous/synchronous form of learning where my students can get this information, absorb this information, then we can go in depth into it in a synchronous form. All right, everyone? Thumbs up, thumbs down, comments down below, and if you haven't done so, please take a few seconds to subscribe. Have yourselves a wonderful day, everyone.